Welcome to Banyen Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyen.com. Since 1970, Banyen Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyen.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Banyen Books podcast. I'm your host, Ross McKeechee. Today, our honored guest is Maria Tatar. Maria Tatar is one of the world's leading folklorists. At Harvard University, she is the John L. Loeb Research Professor of Folklore and Mythology and Germanic Languages and Literatures, as well as a Senior Fellow. Our guest's research focuses on modern German culture, folklore, and children's literature. Maria is recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She has written books about Weimar culture, the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, and childhood reading. One of her recent works, The Annotated Peter Pan, commemorates 100 years of J.M. Barrie's novel, Peter and Wendy. As an editor, her work includes the Norton Critical Edition of the classic fairy tales and the Annotated Brothers Grimm. She has written for the New York Times, the New Republic, and the Harvard Crimson. Her work has also been featured on the Today Show and in Harvard Magazine. Today, Maria is in conversation with Banyen Books about her latest book, The Heroine with 1001 Faces. It's a fantastic book. In this book, she reveals an astonishing but long-buried history of heroines, taking us from Cassandra and Scheherazade to Nancy Drew and Wonder Woman. She explores how heroines, rarely wielding a sword and deprived of a pen, have flown beneath the radar even as they have been bent on social missions. Using the domestic arts and storytelling skills, they have displayed audacity, curiosity, and care as they struggled to survive and change the reigning culture. Scholar and writer Lewis Hyde says this: "Going forward, everyone from kindergarten teachers to movie moguls will have to have the heroine with 1001 faces at hand before they begin their work." So Banyen Books community, please join me in a warm welcome for our guest today, Maria Tatar. Maria, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Really a pleasure to have you here. Now, this book is quite epic in its proportions, and it's a groundbreaking work. I'm very curious to know how you came to write this and what your process was like in its creation.
Well, in many ways, I've been writing this book all my life, and I know that's something of a cliche for writers to say, but I'll take you to the beginning point and the end point in the drive to write this book. First, a mildly traumatic incident from my childhood when I was sitting in one of those vast, soulless auditoriums looking at the prompt for an advanced placement test that was, my passport, going to be my passport to college. And what was the question? But what is a hero? And I was a bookish child, so this should have been a softball question for me, but I found myself rattling off the names of heroes and realizing that they were all disasters, that they were natural born killers, they were experts in carnage, And so I was completely baffled and I froze, and I ended up writing a deeply embarrassing essay about courage that made no sense at all. And so I think in some ways that was the beginning, although it was still very much in my unconscious up through the pandemic. And if you remember in the first days, the first weeks of the pandemic, the spooky silence that came with the pandemic, suddenly we were faced with a situation in which the message was stay at home, don't do anything, don't go out, don't try to, there was no possibility in some ways for heroic action. It was up to the healthcare workers and to the scientists who were driven by curiosity, who had been driven by curiosity, to find ways to counter these sorts of viruses, to come up with vaccines. So care and curiosity, in some ways, those were the two beacons of hope for me. And Carlos Fuentes says that all writing is a struggle against silence. And I think that this book, although I think of it more as a labor of love than a struggle. It was what kept me alive during the pandemic. And the pandemic, of course, gave me an opportunity to read, as I had read as a child, to read voraciously and to reread in wonderful ways. And suddenly these patterns began emerging.
Wonderful. Now, I'd like to touch first on Joseph Campbell's work. Of course, The Hero with a Thousand Faces has garnered so much attention over the years. And just curious to know, what is your relationship to Campbell and his work, and how has it influenced this particular book of yours?
Well, we can start with my title, I think, and I always love it when titles encapsulate the argument of a book. I didn't quite succeed with this title, but as you can see, there are two references. The first is to Campbell's 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And this is a book that became a playbook for Hollywood. It gives us the stations of the hero's journey, 12 in all, and I won't recount all of them, but beginning with the departure and the call to adventure, the hero then moves through an ordeal and returns to civilization with an elixir or a magic potion, something that is healing. Now, Campbell, when you open up Campbell's book, which is, it's a challenging, tough read. I remember spending an entire week with it at one point, reading, doing nothing but reading The Hero with a Thousand Faces. There are very few women mentioned in that book. We have mainly military leaders, spiritual leaders, and of course, women being confined to domestic spaces for much of history didn't have the possibility of going on a journey. And one of the things that I did was to shift the focus from the hero's journey to the heroine's mission. That is, looking at heroines who are driven by care and curiosity, which are, by the way, etymologically related, and women who are also trying to bend the arc of the moral universe to justice, using the domestic arts and crafts, spinning, weaving, and above all, storytelling to sometimes save themselves, but also to save the culture or to change the culture in which they live. So rather than using swords and weapons, they're using words and stories to change the world. And that, of course, takes us to the other reference in my title, The 1001 Heroines. And there, I'm not really trying to do Campbell one better. I'm trying to show the infinite number of possibilities for heroism. And in Arabic, 1001 means both literally 1001 and also an infinite, unending number. So here we are with Scheherazade. And what does Scheherazade do? She volunteers to wed Shahryar, who has been marrying a new woman every day and then the morning after he decapitates that woman, she volunteers. And what does she do to survive? She tells cliffhangers. She tells stories that are so exciting and so seductive that Shahryar decides to delay her execution. And so it's through storytelling that she saves her own neck. But more importantly, she changes Shahryar and the culture in which she lives. She ends this reign, this terrible reign of violence. So in some ways, I think, the goal of this study was to try to install some new foundational figures, not just Eve and Pandora, who bring evil into the world because of their curiosity, which is often misinterpreted, but to bring Scheherazade into the picture and show what she does.
Right. Okay. Now, there's a quote from your book, and I wanted to ask you about this, the power of myths and fairy tales, but also what has been lost in terms of the feminine side. So here, the quote is, "Myths and fairy tales invite us to hit the refresh button, oxygenate the characters, fill in the gaps of the plot, and make new versions. Let us not forget that they were improvised in social spaces as an early form of collective bargaining with call and response, give and take, and a chatty back and forth that often took the form of, 'That's not how I heard it.'" So how does this understanding give permission and open the floodgates for this kind of reimagining of the limited ways that these stories have been told up until now?
Oh, I'm so glad you raised that issue because, of course, myth and fairy tale, they're part of the cauldron of story, what Tolkien called the great cauldron of story. But if we go back to ancient times, they're part of an oral storytelling culture. And there is a back and forth. Now, these stories then migrated into new media, into print culture. They became novels. They became plays. Today, they've moved into film culture. And when they do that, they also change. And, the wonderful thing is that it's never the same old story. So when you mentioned oxygenate the characters, think of all of these women writers, starting with Margaret Atwood and her extraordinary Penelopead, which gives you the Odyssey from Penelope's point of view, to Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls, where we suddenly see the events of the Trojan War through the eyes of Briseis, or Pat Barker's The Women of Troy, or Natalie Haynes's A Thousand Ships. Suddenly, we not only have a new perspective, but we're also inside the minds of the characters in a way that we rarely are in the Iliad or the Odyssey. Also, not in fairy tales at all because they're so action-packed and everything is on the surface. If a character is sad, they just sit down and cry. We don't learn about how they're sad. So you've raised a really big issue, one that takes us to the whole question of how stories are constantly reinvented, repurposed, recycled, made relevant, and then adjusted according to the medium and also the teller and the audience. So there's a constant churn, which is of course a great thing because, as I said, we don't want things to ossify and never change. Metamorphosis, change, renewal is at the heart of storytelling, of our storytelling practices.
Thank you. Now, one of the major themes throughout the book is that when the hero's stories are told through the eyes of the feminine perspective, they're striving for things like care, curiosity, and social justice. You touched on it a few moments ago in the first question about the etymological roots of the word care, and they're tied, I believe, with curiosity. Is that true?
Yes, think of curiosity, kura, which means care. And if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and start to look at not just the etymology, but the various uses of curiosity, you discovered that curiosity once meant, many centuries ago, in its first documented uses, meant paying care and attentive concern to something. So, I mean, I just mentioned even Pandora, who are curious creatures. Eve's curiosity has been interpreted as carnal curiosity, when in fact, she wants to eat of the tree of she wants to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And so women have been positioned through their curiosity as bringing sin and evil into the world, when in fact that curiosity can be seen as something very different. It can be inflected very differently, and it often takes the form of caring about others, wanting to break out of a certain mold, be adventurous and exploratory. And often limits are set on that curiosity.
Yeah, and I was really, particularly in this realm in your book, the story of Bluebeard stood out to me. And can you tell us a little bit about, I didn't know that story. Can you tell us a bit about that story, and why was the focus on the sort of villainization of the wife's curiosity versus the murderous tendencies of the husband?
Yes, isn't that extraordinary? That's a famous fairy tale, first recorded in France by Charles Perrault, and it's still read by French children today, shockingly, although it's often left out of editions of Perrault in the United States and English-speaking countries. And it's a story about a serial murderer, a man who, think of Shahryar too, a man who murders his wives, usually 7 wives. And the tale begins with a new marriage. Bluebeard manages to persuade the mother of 3 daughters to have one of the daughters marry him. They have a grand old time in the palace. Bluebeard's wife invites all her friends. And in the meantime, what does she do? She takes the key that her husband has given to her. He's offered her a key, and he said, you can go anywhere you want, just don't go into the room don't go into the room that can be opened with this particular key. Well, of course, he's almost inviting her to transgress, and sure enough, she goes into that room, and what does she see but the corpses of his previous wives, sometimes hanging from a hook, sometimes on the ground. And it's a kind of foundational horror story. So there she is, and she's so frightened by what she sees that she drops the key, stains it with blood, and when Bluebeard asks for the key, he knows that she has opened the door, and he threatens to kill her. She begs for her life, and at the last minute, Sister Anne, who has mysteriously been in the castle, summons help from the brothers and rescues Bluebeard's wife. Charles Perrault attached a moral to that story, and the moral was, women, don't be so curious. And ever after, everyone who addressed that story through Bettelheim and the uses of enchantment said that it was a warning about disobedience and about sexual curiosity, when it's in fact a story about a serial murder, about the dangers of marrying a stranger, what can happen to you. And this was a story that was probably told in those domestic arenas, in the spinning rooms, in the storytelling circles, in sewing groups, and that kind of thing, to talk about, what the worst possible thing that could happen in a marriage, to get people talking. And, in some ways you needed a horror story. You needed something that magnified and enlarged the perils of marriage to get people talking and to tell their own stories and to gossip about this person and that person. So, another case of curiosity being demonized and seen as negative, when in fact it can be a life-saving tool. And you see that in all of the women detectives that emerge in the course of the 20th century. You know, they want to get to the bottom of things, and they want to make sure that the world is safe for other women. A prime example, Lisbeth Salander in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, who's this wonderfully mercurial creature who is out not just to get revenge for the abuse to which she's been subjected, but also to make the world a better place for other women.
Yes. I want to touch on this idea of telling a single story. I love what you had to say about the way the hero with 1,000 faces has been tragically reduced to a stereotype, one that is not just incomplete, but in a sense also untrue, for it often tells only a small part of a story, just half the story, and sometimes even less than that. Now, I just want to add that I do know quite a few men in today's culture that are worried that masculinity is under attack, and I disagree. I wholeheartedly feel that it's actually what's happening is we're hearing more of the story now instead of just a single story. And you mentioned Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's 2009 TED Talk on the perils of reductive thinking and of telling a single story. Can you speak to that?
Oh, yes. That's, I think, a quite extraordinary statement, the perils of a single story. And as I was writing this book, I began to understand the importance of what Nietzsche actually called perspectivalism, that is, seeing things from different perspectives, and how you can never really get to the truth without understanding those different perspectives. Think of the story of Philomela. It may not be one that is all that familiar to a general audience, but it's a story that it appears in Edith Hamilton's mythology and in Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's in some versions, it's titled The Dangerous Sisters. Well, here's the deal. Philomela is raped by her brother-in-law, Tereus. She threatens to broadcast what he has done, to broadcast the sexual assault. And how does he respond? By cutting out her tongue. And Ovid gives us a vivid description of that tongue quivering on the floor. So what does Philomela do but resort to the domestic arts and crafts, using cunning, using craft, also using beauty in an odd way? I think that has to be brought into the story as well. She creates this beautiful and horrifying tapestry, which she gives to her sister, and it depicts her rape. The two sisters then are united in a terrible act of revenge, so they do become dangerous. But the fact that the story is you know, there's a kind of endless cycle of revenge. But the fact that the story is described as the dangerous sisters reveals exactly how we've been looking at these stories from a single perspective. Or the story of, I mean, think of the Odyssey, Odysseus. We see things from his perspective, but read Circe, not just Margaret Atwood's Penelope Ad, but Madeline Miller's extraordinary novel Circe, and we get her story, her backstory, and we discover a completely different world. And so, you know, we need these different versions of a story in order not just to arrive at some abstract truth, because I don't think we'll ever do that. That's sort of a fantasy, but to engage with the story and to start talking about it and to say, you know, this is, well, as you said, this is not how I want to think about it. I want to tell it this way. And there's been this wonderful efflorescence of storytelling. I've gotten wonderful messages and letters from readers of my book who have sent me their own stories, sometimes autobiographical and sometimes fictional. reminding me of how writing is not just a form of therapy. Telling your story is not just a form of therapy, but also a form of self-actualization, of figuring out who you are, what your identity is, what your values are, and how you want to move into the future.
Right. And this is one of the major themes in your book is the power of speaking up and sharing one's story. What is the healing power in that?
Um, Sharing the story, well, first of all, no longer being silenced. That is, there are two sides to that particular story. And I think I spent a lot of time talking about the various strategies that have been used to silence women. I've mentioned a few examples. I could also mention Cassandra, who loses her credibility, who is given the gift of prophecy by Apollo. Um, he's interested in seducing her. She has misgivings about that. So he takes it back by spitting in her mouth, which means that nobody will ever believe what she says. So that's another form of silencing in a way. So you have all of these different strategies that have been used, including reducing women's talk to gossip and chatter and idle chit chat. And then the extraordinary power of telling a story, which is, as I said earlier, the one weapon that women had, the sword that I hate to use these military metaphors, but the strategy that women had for getting their version of a story out there, for seeing things from a new perspective. And as I said, that can be both therapeutic, but also world changing, and creating new communities for not just telling stories, but thinking about what we can do to change the current circumstances in which we're living.
Right, right. You've touched on beauty, and I really am interested in this, what you call the double bind of beauty that women may have found themselves in historically, where they're both prized and condemned for their beauty. Can you speak to that?
Yes, right. Well, first, the Trojan War, how did it all start? A beauty contest. Uh, and we know about the danger. Helen of Troy is often blamed for the war, when in fact the Greeks probably just wanted to loot Troy. I mean, there's another way of looking at that particular story. So, and think of, well, Dickens' version of the French Revolution, which traces everything to a sexual assault on a woman. I mean, so there's a funny way in which women are blamed for a lot. And we could go back to Pandora, who brought toil, famine, plagues, war into the world. There is a way, though, in which I think women also deploy beauty. I mean, we could talk about, seduction and the Judith and Holofernes, for example, or this idea of using your beauty as a powerful weapon, in a way, weaponizing your beauty. And that story is not one that I tell in this particular book, although I've touched on it in other places. But then there's a whole question of, as I said, these domestic crafts, which also are creative and beautiful and artful. And so that there's that artistic dimension to women's work and to their storytelling. And of course, the stories are also beautiful. Madeline Miller's Circe is just so moving and powerful. So that is one aspect, the beauty and creativity and handicrafts. That's a part of the story that I touch on in this book, though I would love to see someone do more with that particular topic.
Right. William Marston's Wonder Woman. What an amazing story. He was such an, I guess, an odd duck for his time, really, wasn't he? Can you tell us a little bit about his background and the emergence of Wonder Woman?
Yes. extraordinary. And if you want to know more, read Joe Lepore's book on Marston and Wonder Woman, which was a great adventure for me. I remember this was one of the thrills of writing this book, is to discover these worlds that other writers had opened up. As a child, I read Wonder Woman comics and was completely enamored of her, even though, you know, she wore that odd bathing suit. I worried a little bit about that. But can you imagine Marston invents Wonder Woman in the late 30s, early 40s, around the time that Joseph Campbell is writing The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And they're really in the same part of the world also, which is kind of an eerie thought. And I've always wondered whether Campbell's students came with the baggage of Wonder Woman to Sarah Lawrence and maybe asked about someone like a figure like Wonder Woman. And so Marston invents this superheroine who is sort of a representative of the strength of women who will save the world through their beauty, through their power, through their magnetism, through their electrical abilities, and will change the world. And he saw a future in which women would dominate men. And for him, this would be a real revolution. It would mean an end to war and to aggression and belligerence. So it's extraordinary that he has not been credited with changing the culture more, because I think many in my generation and in successive generations and in earlier generations too grew up with that series, which was followed by a comic book series about famous women. Now these famous women, and I remember reading this too, were predominantly it started out with Florence Nightingale, Edith Cavell, Clara Barton. These were nurses, caregivers. You know, in those days, women were pretty much excluded from the medical profession. They did not become doctors, but they engaged in extraordinary acts of heroism as nurses. So I think that was the early version of many of the volumes that are coming out today about rebel girls and women who persist. Nevertheless, they persisted. And all of these new heroines that we've discovered from our collective past.
So there's this concept, you call it emotional heavy lifting. I'll read this quote, and this is something that I was aware of, but not consciously. And maybe as a man, it's a different perspective. So you say the history of nursing bears out the fact that women, instead of being celebrated for their heroism, have been repeatedly penalized and punished for the extraordinary emotional heavy lifting they have performed in our social world. So I'm wondering if you can just unpack that a little bit for us in terms of, first off, what do you mean by emotional heavy lifting for those who might not be have a full understanding of what that really means?
Great question. And it reminds me that I haven't given enough thought to it, in a way, to the whole question of what is now known as emotional labor, the kind of work that what we used to call stewardesses, flight attendants today did on airplanes. That is, they not only carried out their tasks, but they dealt with the anxieties of passengers, with disabilities. They did all kinds of work that then, you know, put them into the box of, oh, that's women's work. And it's sort of unpaid, not only undignified or not dignified with the aura of respect of labor carried out by men, but also not paid in a way. So that kind of, this bifurcation of, let's say, medical practices into nursing and caring for people on the one hand, and then operating or let's say prescribing medicines on the other, is is so deeply problematic. And it reminds me that today I'm told psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and therapists tell me that what do doctors and physicians do? They basically just write out prescriptions, and they leave the therapy, the caregiving to professions that are dominated mainly by women. Think of the absurdity of, it's in Meet the Parents that Greg Fokker aspires to be a nurse, and that's considered laughable by the macho father of his fiancée. But now that's a stereotype and a cliche, but it's one that still holds true today, I think. Now, we should talk a little bit about how that is changing, how that, strict bifurcation into male, female, it's changing right before our eyes. When I look out my window here, if I see a carriage, a baby carriage, a stroller, it's often pushed by a guy at least half the time. And so not only are roles rapidly shifting and morphing and transforming into one another, but there's also a kind of fluidity that is taking place, gender fluidity. And I think, what you mentioned before about men who are worried about being emasculated, but also lots of men who are discovering the model of the heroine and are embracing it, and are saying, that's exactly what I've been doing. And I don't want to be that military hero. I don't, in our culture today, what are we doing? We're taking down the statues of Confederate soldiers, and we're raising new statues of civil rights workers. Mary Bethune is now in this statuary hall in the Capitol. And we have tributes to emancipation, which show us enslaved peoples. And it's not so much that we're turning just to victims, but to those who have been courageous and who have sought, even as victims, to survive and to help others. Harriet Tubman, what an extraordinary story that is. And, we still don't have her on the $20 bill, but by God, we will one day, I hope. And there she is, she frees herself. She's born as an enslaved person. She liberates herself. And what's the first thing on her mind? What does she do? She wants to go back and rescue others and become a conductor on the Underground Railroad.
Now, I want to come back to Joseph Campbell for a moment. I'm curious because you share in your epilogue, you share a quote from his book, Goddesses. And I'm wondering, do you think that his perspective may have changed through his career? He mentions this liftoff that he saw happening. And what kind of changes do you think he saw, and what kind of changes do you see happening now and going forward?
Yeah, I grew to respect Campbell more and more as I wrote this book. I mentioned at the beginning this idea of he sees women as those who give birth to the hero, who also are muses and serve as the goal of the hero. So he sort of excludes women, although Hadley starts with the frog princess and a girl who hurls a frog against who's angry and stands up to this frog. But he doesn't have much to say about women. So I think over the years, he studies goddesses, of course, too, but he begins to see that the models are changing, and he sees the way in which women are entering the labor force in new ways and discovers new possibilities for them. And Campbell is somebody who was so wonderfully adventurous. That is, he didn't limit, he started out deeply interested in Native American lore. And he was outraged by the US's treatment of indigenous peoples and the way in which indigenous peoples had been robbed of their lands. So he started with his own world and then expanded out, going all over the world in search of spiritual wisdom of his. He quit graduate school because they were trying to box him in geographically. And he was so wonderfully expansive in that way. And in the Power of Myth too, I think, you see him in conversation with Bill Moyers and how he is truly in conversation and learning from Moyers as well. And in addition to that, he's going to the movies. And Hollywood is, whatever you say about Hollywood, they are often ahead of the curve and seeing things. They have to be, in a way, that are not in our collective imagination, not consciously in our collective imagination. So there he was, and I'm surprised he didn't change more rapidly given the fact that he was at Sarah Lawrence. But I think that was in part because he was such a celebrity and kind of untouchable in a way. So people were reluctant to challenge his views in many ways. But yes, I mean, Campbell is just such a fascinating person, just personally, a great subject to look at in biographical terms.
Thank you. Before we get to our audience questions, I just wanted to ask, because your book, The Heroine with 1001 Faces, it is part of a groundbreaking body of literature that is emerging. And I'm curious to know your reflections on your book at this point. Now that you've started doing interviews and having conversations, what kind of new doorways are you seeing being opened in yourself and in these conversations that you maybe expected or didn't expect through your book?
Oh, well, that's a great question. And I suppose I should take a look at that in autobiographical terms, first of all, and thinking about how, as a culture, we now value empathy. And it's something that we preach in the schools. We're living in an age of empathy. There are hundreds of books about empathy that come out on a almost annual basis. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I think that for me, empathy is such an important virtue, and we want to know about the pain of others, the suffering of others, and feel what they feel, get under their skin and all of that. But I'm hoping that I personally, and the culture too, makes the move from empathy and feeling to curiosity and action. Because curiosity, as I mentioned, has that element of care in it. And when you care, you're going to do more than feel, I think. You're actually going to go out into the world and do something. And I think the pandemic has also, even though we're still, restricted in many ways, a friend of mine wanted to work on a suicide hotline, a therapist of many years, and was told that he could not do that because they had halted the training program, which had to be in person. So in some ways, our opportunities are limited in ways, but I think we have to prepare ourselves to go back into the world. And, trying to make a difference, to actually do something with those feelings that we have, with those empathetic feelings that we have learned to foster and promote in ourselves. And now's the time to translate them into action.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, we've got some really nice looking questions here from our live audience. The first one we're going to get to is from Mike, who says, when we're speaking about either the hero's journey or the heroine's, I feel like there's a risk of thinking about our stories through a binaristic lens. How do we use these comparative models or analyses of myth and story to break through the binary toward a vision and the creation of more diverse stories?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and one that I have worried quite a lot about, because I'm looking backwards at our history and where we've positioned, how we've positioned heroes and heroines. I'm also deeply interested in the heroism of everyday lives. That is, we wake up every morning to a new adventure, and we have to go through, depending on where we're socially situated, we have to go through ordeals. And by the end of the day or the end of the week or the end of the month, let's hope that we've done something. So in some ways, I think we could talk about heroes with a capital H, cultural heroes, and heroes with a lowercase h. I always felt at the end of, when I was raising raising children, I always felt I should get a medal at the end of the day. I had been, raising a child raising children is heroic. So we could think in terms of the capital H and the small h, and maybe, what is the path forward? I'm not sure that I have the answer. Do we just make hero kind of generic? I'm not so sure if we should make that move, but how do we break the binary? And I think one way that we do it is to say we're totally comfortable as men and women, as non-binary, moving back and forth on a spectrum of possibilities. Maybe we have to invent a new word that is not gender specific at all, but that opens up the infinite possibilities that are available in heroism. And what I want my book to do, though, is start a conversation, not about a journey, but about the values that are embedded in our idea of what it means to be heroic. So that's a partial answer. And I know that you can't respond back, but thank you for the question. And I hope that it's the beginning of an answer, at least.
Thank you. I just want to say, just from a male perspective, the most mature and confident men that I know are the ones that they have no qualms about saying, yeah, this is my feminine side. And, it's not a dirty word for them to be expressing in the feminine.
Oh, yes, thank you for that. And I love the fact that men now talk about, I find that men are more interested in cooking than women. That is, it seems to be a new trend. The food culture is something that is, maybe because they've been kept from it for so long.
Yeah, I think that might be true. There's a question here from Annette who says, I've spent the last 20 years bringing storytelling to business consulting to widen perspectives, but they prefer the hero story as a format. What hints have you found to entice those who want to control the multiple narratives to instead be curious as to what they have to say?
Well, that's there's a lot to unpack there. Sort of controlling the narratives and thinking about the concept of a hero as male with a capital H. And I assume by storytelling, you're sort of talking about looking at individual experiences and communicating those. I have to say that I always feel a little bit uncomfortable with sort of the business model for storytelling, or sometimes even, I remember once a dean here at Harvard who recruited chairs to get him to start thinking about fundraising. And he said, oh, I want your stories. I want to hear, I want to enliven this, and I want this to be about storytelling. And I immediately recoiled from that concept because I saw it as sort of opportunistic in a way. Although, in many ways you could argue he was doing the right thing. He was trying to put out stories about transformation and change, and how students through their education came to be empowered as scientists or as engineers or as scholars. So those individual stories can be truly powerful. The stories of an immigrant who comes to this country at age 5 or so and does something, and I will cite a real life example, who does nothing but watch Disney films, each one 100 times, and then lo and behold becomes a writer. A successful writer whose books are turned into films. So yes, that's a partial answer to your question. Thank you for that.
Thank you. There's a question from Arlo, and this is an interesting one. I'm sure you get asked this, and I know the answer. I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Arlo asks, are there stages or stations of the heroine's journey, a parallel to Campbell's stages of the hero's journey?
Oh, well, I want to hear your answer to that. But I guess in some ways implicitly, and I think I say this in the book too, I'm moving against that, although there's a wonderful book by Maureen Murdoch called The Heroine's Journey, so you might want to look at that. But there are many fairy tales in which women do travel. And in one, a young woman puts on iron shoes and she has to wear them out before she finds the beloved and has a chance to rescue him and to redeem him. So one could look at actual physical journeys, women who do travel and undertake redemptive journeys. But for the most part, because they stay at home, they can only undergo a kind of spiritual journey or transformation. And that, of course, happens because everything is a journey. But I think I'm reluctant to try to take Campbell's model and create a female counterpart for the very reasons that I stated at the outset, because the woman's experience is so very different. And what about you?
Well, I should reframe that. I had heard you in your interview yesterday speak to that. And so I kind of knew a little bit how you might respond to it and why you would steer clear. So not that I personally know the answer. I don't know anything.
You know a lot. You're just modest. Yeah.
There's a note from Annette who had asked the question about storytelling in the business setting, and she added, and she said, that's my point actually, how to keep it from being opportunistic, with a question mark.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wish I knew the answer and probably how to keep it. I think maybe that you have to really feel passionate about that particular story. And if it touches you and hits you, then it seems to me it's all right. But if you're just using it in an exploitative way, it is deeply problematic.
On the question of sort of the stages in the heroine's journey, there's a question from Catherine who says, are you familiar with Kim Hudson's The Virgin's Promise? And how do you feel about the 12 steps of her heroine's journey?
Oh, yikes. No, I am not familiar with that. And, there is, oh gosh, I plunged into this sea of literature, and then post publication, I'm learning that I could really write I'm not going to write a second volume. I'll leave that to somebody else, but there's so much more out there. And, it's extraordinary how much scholarship is out there about, the distaff side, women's journeys actually, and their heroism.
Right. Thank you. There's a question from Karen here, and I might have a follow-up question to this one actually. Karen asks, why do you think we are seeing so many retellings of ancient myths right now?
Well, great question. And I would say that part of it started with fairy tales, actually, retellings of fairy tales, not so much from a different perspective, but just, you know, a reboot of, say, the story of Snow White or Cinderella. You have the cinematic version, Snow White and the Huntsman. You have all of these different versions of Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, there's Hard Candy, Freeway. But there were also the women in the 80s and 90s, Anne Sexton's Transformations, Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, Margaret Atwood's rewriting of fairy tales. These efforts to mine stories from times past for material and to create new narratives with a liberating potential. And I think that there's something about myths. You know, myths are sacred stories. So, you know, I talked earlier about the great cauldron of stories, but myths being sacred stories seemed kind of untouchable. So I think the move after fairy tales, after these iconoclastic retellings of fairy tales, was to take the myths and look at them from different perspectives, take them apart. And I think it took, I can't say that it took more courage, because Sexton, Carter, and Atwood, Toni Morrison, who did this same thing with African-American folklore, really so courageous. But I think that there was a kind of reluctance to move to the Odyssey, the Iliad. How dare you touch that? I mean, we have a translation by a woman for the first time of the Odyssey, and so I think that was a slower move, and now that it's happened, of course, I think there will be a proliferation of these narratives, and they're so fascinating. They're just endlessly fascinating.
Right. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for submitting your questions. Really wonderful to see. And before we close, I just want to take this opportunity to thank our live audience, of course, and thank everyone in the Banyen Books community who's supported the store over the years. And our owner, Colin Limworth, who's been at it for 50 years and still going strong. And Jacob Steele, who's our podcast producer and events coordinator for Banyen, who sort of curates and brings all these events and programs to the fore for all of us. Maria, I'd like to close by just asking you what's next for you. This is an amazing book. How do you plan to build on it going forward, or what kind of projects are you looking at now?
Oh, well, my first project is always to clean up, and that's taking a while. But you know, I'm not sure. I think possibly something creative, and I always like to alternate sort of works that really require labor, love too, of course, with books that are fun to write. So who knows? I'm going to just let things percolate right now, and I'm just enjoying tremendously the response to the book and the opportunity to talk with people like you about it. And I hope one of these days to come into the shop in person.
Oh, we'd love to have you there. We really would.
And get some books from you.
Yes. Everyone, her book is called The Heroine with 1,001 Faces. We've been speaking with Maria Tatar. And Maria, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyen Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. And I'm your host, Ross McKeechie. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyen Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyen.com.